When we talk about slavery in the American South, most stories that come to mind focus on black women enduring unimaginable hardships and the cruelty of white male overseers. We picture cotton fields, chains, and the relentless sun beating down on bodies forced to labor for someone else's profit. These narratives are important. They reveal the inhumanity of the system and the courage of those who survived, but there is a chapter of history that is rarely explored. A story that has remained in the shadows for far too long. The experiences of black men at the hands of white women. For generations, the image of the innocent Southern lady dominated society's imagination. White women were portrayed as gentle, virtuous, and morally superior, creatures to be protected rather than protectors themselves. Yet behind the closed doors of plantation houses, some wielded a quiet but profound power over the men who were enslaved within their households. This power was not only physical or economic, it was deeply psychological and, in many cases, manipulative. It allowed them to control lives in ways that left lasting scars, often invisible to the outside world. Imagine living in a world where refusing someone could cost you everything: your safety, your freedom, even your life, and where the person holding that power was expected to be innocent in the eyes of everyone else. For black men in the Antebellum South, such scenarios were not hypothetical. They were daily realities. These men navigated a treacherous landscape where social myths protected the very people who could manipulate, threaten, or exploit them. They were trapped in a system where their voices could not be trusted, their experiences often denied, and their suffering largely ignored by history. Through legal documents, oral histories, and first-hand testimonies collected decades later, we now have glimpses into this hidden world. Stories emerge of men who endured coercion, emotional manipulation, and even forced family arrangements orchestrated by white women with the full weight of social and legal authority behind them. These accounts are chilling, not just because of the acts themselves, but because they reveal a complexity in the power dynamics of slavery that has been overlooked for too long. In this video, we will uncover these hidden histories. We will meet men whose courage and resilience have been overshadowed by centuries of silence. We will explore the mechanisms of control, the societal myths that protected perpetrators, and the quiet heroism of those who lived through unimaginable circumstances. This is a story that demands to be told, a piece of history that completes the broader picture of slavery in America. If you are ready to learn a side of history that has been overlooked for generations, stay with us. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can follow along with every episode as we shine a light on untold stories from the past. By supporting this channel, you help ensure that these voices are heard and that the lessons of history are not forgotten. Now, let us begin this journey into the hidden narratives of the past, where courage, survival, and the struggle for dignity intertwine in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about slavery in the American South. In the Antebellum South, the image of white women as delicate, innocent, and morally superior was one of the most enduring myths of the era, a portrayal so powerful that it shaped laws, social norms, and daily life across entire communities. Beneath this carefully constructed image, however, lay a complex and often hidden reality. Within the walls of plantation houses and the private confines of domestic spaces, some white women held a degree of control over the lives of enslaved men that extended far beyond mere household management. This control was not always violent in the overt sense, like the lash of a whip or the harsh demands of an overseer. It was psychological, emotional, and intimate, exercised through manipulation, expectation, and authority that could shape the course of a man's life without leaving any visible mark. For the enslaved men who lived under these circumstances, The presence of a white mistress could be both a source of danger and a perplexing puzzle to navigate. They learned early that compliance and silence were not simply matters of survival, they were the only way to maintain even the slightest semblance of safety or dignity. The power a white woman could wield was amplified by the society around her, which viewed her as untouchable and morally beyond reproach. Within the broader racial hierarchy of the South, her word carried authority that no black man's testimony could counter, and any perceived transgression on his part could have devastating consequences. The very social myths that portrayed her as powerless in the public sphere became instruments of control in private, allowing her to manipulate, coerce, or punish without challenge. Historical accounts reveal that this control often took forms that blurred the lines between household authority and personal intrusion. Men like David in Virginia or James in Kentucky, whose stories survive through legal records and court testimonies, were subjected to circumstances where the affections and attentions of a white woman were intertwined with threats, obligations, and expectations they could not refuse. These were not equal relationships in any meaningful sense. They were arrangements structured by power, property, and social perception. A glance, a summoned presence, or even a subtle command could determine where a man slept, with whom he formed a bond, or whether he would be allowed to keep his family intact. In such situations, what appeared to the outside world as a romantic liaison or mutual affection was in fact a carefully enforced imbalance, a microcosm of the broader system of enslavement where autonomy was systematically denied. The emotional weight of this control was profound. Black men were forced into a constant negotiation of risk and compliance, where every interaction could be interpreted as consent, defiance, or a threat. A smile could be construed as insolence, distance as suspicion, and any attempt at resistance could provoke punishment that ranged from the emotional public humiliation or social ostracism to the practical and severe, including the forced sale of family members to distant plantations. Such manipulations left deep psychological scars, often invisible to the world outside the household, and created a reality in which enslaved men carried trauma that could neither be spoken of nor fully acknowledged. The silence imposed upon them was both self-preserving and enforced, as even a whispered complaint could lead to suspicion, reprisal, or physical danger. Beyond individual interactions, white women also exerted a systemic form of control through reproductive authority, a chilling extension of the power they held over the men under their households. With the transatlantic slave trade officially ending in 1808, the growth of enslaved populations became an economic imperative, and the reproduction of human beings was systematically managed for profit. Men like Luke in Alabama were selected for their strength and fertility, their lives monitored, their labor and intimacy dictated by overseers and household mistresses alike. These men were not permitted to form genuine attachments or to make choices about their partners. Their intimate relationships were calculated, regulated, and imposed in a manner reminiscent of the treatment of livestock, yet with consequences that shaped entire human lives. Every child born into this system increased the wealth of the plantation, but for the men involved, it was a loss of agency, a theft of personal autonomy, and often the beginning of a cycle of separation and dispossession for their families. In other households, white women acted with subtlety rather than overt coercion. Using persuasion, fend affection, or emotional manipulation to assert their authority, they could win the trust of a man, only to use it to enforce compliance, leaving him caught between gratitude and fear, admiration and suspicion. The constant unpredictability of these relationships created an environment where enslaved men had no safe response, no assured path to security, and no means of expressing true consent. It was a control so complete that it penetrated the most personal spheres of life. Redefining intimacy, loyalty, and human connection in ways that were inseparable from the institution of slavery itself. The legal system and social customs of the time reinforced this dynamic, ensuring that the power exercised by white women remained largely unchecked. Courts consistently favored their testimony over that of black men, regardless of the circumstances or evidence. False accusations could result in extreme punishments, including execution, while the women themselves were subjected to at most minor embarrassment or reprimand. This asymmetry codified a reality in which the moral and social perception of innocence protected those who were, in private, wielding profound control over the lives of others. Understanding this hidden dimension of slavery challenges conventional narratives and exposes the complex interplay of race, gender, and power that defined the antebellum South. It reminds us that cruelty and coercion were not confined to the field or to the lash. They could be intimate, subtle, and psychologically devastating, enacted by individuals whose public persona suggested gentleness and moral superiority. By examining these stories, historians and scholars restore the voices of those who endured this hidden oppression, acknowledging the full scope of human experience under slavery and revealing the ways in which power and control could be exercised through domestic and personal spheres with consequences as profound as any physical punishment. This deeper understanding compels us to look beyond familiar tropes and myths, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to recognize the resilience and courage of men who navigated this treacherous terrain. Their experiences illuminate not only the brutal mechanics of slavery, but also the insidious ways in which authority, social expectation, and perceived innocence could be weaponized against those without power, leaving legacies that endured long after the chains were gone. In the shadowed corners of plantation homes, where society's myths of innocence and gentility were most carefully maintained, some white women exercised a form of control over enslaved men that went far beyond the ordinary management of household affairs. A control that could turn affection into coercion and trust into a weapon. One of the most striking illustrations of this dark reality is the story of David, a black man living in Virginia during the early 19th century, whose life became entangled in the dangerous intersection of social perception, gendered power, and systemic oppression. David's story reminds us that the horrors of slavery were not confined to the fields or the lash. They could unfold in quiet hallways, private rooms, and spaces where the world outside assumed there could be no wrongdoing, because to see a white woman as capable of exerting harm would have upended the very foundations of Southern society. David was not a willing participant in the drama that unfolded around him. He was a man bound by laws, customs, and social structures that left him with little autonomy over his own body or destiny. Yet confronted with a persistent and perilous challenge from a woman whose power over him was absolute in practice. The woman, Dolly Getz, was unmarried and lived in the household where David worked. According to sworn testimony collected at the time, she initiated a sexual relationship with him that lasted for years, repeatedly attempting to persuade him to elope and take up a life entirely dictated by her desires. For David, compliance was not merely a matter of avoiding personal discomfort, it was a matter of survival. He understood the stakes of crossing boundaries in a society where a black man traveling with a white woman could be accused of crimes he did not commit, imprisoned, or worse. The power imbalance was undeniable, and David's choices were constrained not only by the law but by the rigid expectations of race and gender that governed every interaction. When David finally decided to distance himself from Dolly, the very authority she had exercised over him transformed into a weapon. Her rejection, which he had anticipated as a potential threat, materialized in the form of a false accusation, claiming that he had committed a crime he had not perpetrated. In the eyes of the law, her word carried weight far beyond his own, reflecting the societal presumption that white women were incapable of wrongdoing, while black men were perpetually suspect. David was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death, his life hanging on the precarious balance of credibility that favored whiteness over justice. Despite clear evidence and community testimony confirming that Dolly had been the instigator, and that David had resisted her advances, the system that should have protected him upheld the verdict. His existence became a testament to the cruel efficiency with which power, prejudice, and legal structures could combine to punish the vulnerable while shielding the privileged. This pattern of coercion and manipulation was not unique to David's experience. Yet his case is particularly illustrative because it exposes the ways in which intimate authority could be exercised with devastating consequences. The combination of social myths, legal bias, and the personal agency afforded to white women within the domestic sphere created a dangerous environment where enslaved men had to navigate desire, threat, and obligation in ways that were nearly impossible to reconcile. Even acts that might outwardly appear consensual could be layered with intimidation and the implicit threat of reprisal, leaving the men caught in a constant negotiation between self-preservation and forced compliance. These experiences demonstrate that power in the antebellum South was not solely a matter of brute force, but could be embedded in subtle, personal, and deeply psychological forms of control that shaped lives in lasting ways. David's ordeal also highlights the chillingly transactional nature of societal perception. While he faced execution, Dolly received only a public reprimand, a symbolic gesture that preserved her reputation and social standing. The contrast between their fates underscores the broader systemic dynamics of race, gender, and authority that enabled white women to exercise coercive power with near impunity, while black men were left with few avenues for defense or redress. The inequity was magnified by the prevailing belief in the inherent innocence of white women, a belief so pervasive that even evidence and community testimony could be insufficient to prevent the gravest injustices. In such a climate, resistance was perilous, silence was survival, and the emotional and psychological toll was profound. These stories, drawn from legal records, personal testimonies, and later historical scholarship, reveal a complex matrix of control, coercion, and societal complicity. They illustrate that the abuses of power in slavery were not only physical but also deeply interpersonal and manipulative, exploiting assumptions about virtue, morality, and gender. The psychological dimension of these relationships was inextricably linked to the structural realities of enslavement, where autonomy, choice, and dignity were systematically denied. Each decision, each act of coercion, and each false accusation reinforced a hierarchy that left men like David vulnerable to the whims of a system designed to prioritize reputation and property over truth and justice. Understanding David's experience allows us to see the hidden mechanisms of control that shape the daily lives of enslaved men, revealing how social myth, legal bias, and personal authority could converge to produce devastating consequences. It challenges us to expand our understanding of slavery beyond the visible symbols of oppression, and to recognize the subtle, often invisible ways in which power operated within domestic spaces. His story is a window into a world where survival required constant vigilance, where obedience was both imposed and negotiated, and where the line between coercion and consent was deliberately blurred by those who held authority. By examining cases like David's, we gain insight into the broader patterns of exploitation and manipulation that defined the antebellum South, reminding us that the human impact of slavery extended far beyond the public sphere and the plantation fields. These accounts illuminate the courage and resilience of those who endured unspeakable pressures, and they challenge us to confront the uncomfortable truths about the ways in which power and privilege were exercised, maintained, and protected across generations. shaping not only individual lives but the very fabric of society itself. In the Antebellum South, the law was rarely an instrument of justice for black men, especially when conflicts arose with white women, whose perceived innocence and social standing placed them far above any scrutiny or accountability. The courts, shaped by the prevailing racial and gender hierarchies, consistently sided with white women, often punishing enslaved men for acts they had little control over while imposing only the most minor penalties, if any, on the women who initiated or manipulated those same situations. This legal bias created an environment where power and authority were codified not only through custom but through law itself, and where the lives of black men could be destroyed on the word of a white woman, regardless of evidence, context, or coercion. The story of David in Virginia is a chilling testament to this reality. But it was far from unique. Across the South, countless men endured similar injustices, their fates hinging on a system designed to preserve white privilege and social myths at the expense of human dignity. Imagine the terror of living in a world where a single accusation could determine your fate, where no defense could overturn a narrative so socially sanctioned, and where truth mattered less than perception. Enslaved men were acutely aware of the precariousness of their existence, knowing that a misstep, a refusal, or even a perceived slight could lead to imprisonment, corporal punishment, or death. In many cases, the women involved wielded this power with deliberate intent, understanding that the law would back them and that social norms would reinforce their authority. The law did not exist to protect these men. It existed to reinforce the hierarchy that placed white women at the top and black men at the bottom, ensuring that the consequences of defiance were both swift and severe. The court's favoritism was not always subtle. Records from trials, petitions, and legal documents reveal that even when community testimony overwhelmingly supported the men's innocence, the word of a white woman was often enough to secure conviction. This was a system in which the concept of impartiality was subordinate to the preservation of racial and gendered power. Punishments meted out to men could range from public flogging to execution, while the women who had coerced, manipulated, or falsely accused them were often spared serious consequences, sometimes receiving only mild public censure or a token fine. The disparity between these outcomes underscores the extent to which justice was contingent on social identity rather than evidence or morality, a reality that shaped not only individual lives but the broader social fabric of the South. Even beyond overt legal proceedings, the influence of courts and law extended into daily life. Black men understood that their ability to navigate domestic and social interactions was constrained by the ever-present knowledge that the law would protect the word of a white woman above their own testimony. Every refusal, every negotiation of personal space, and every attempt at autonomy carried the risk of escalation into legal action. The possibility of punishment was not theoretical, it was a constant, invisible presence that shaped behavior, dictated choices, and instilled a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Enslaved men had to learn not only how to survive physically, but how to survive psychologically within a system that could validate coercion, excuse manipulation, and criminalize resistance. This dynamic of legal favoritism reinforced the broader power structures of slavery. White women, often constrained in public roles, found in the domestic and personal sphere an opportunity to exercise authority that was legally and socially sanctioned. They could manipulate relationships, enforce obedience, and maintain control over the men in their households with the assurance that any challenge to their authority would likely be dismissed or punished. In effect, the courts acted as enforcers of an invisible hierarchy, legitimizing the power imbalances that structured the lives of both the enslaved and their enslavers. The psychological toll on black men was immense. as the constant threat of legal repercussions added a layer of oppression that was both pervasive and inescapable. Historical scholarship. Oral histories and archival research illuminate the scope of this injustice. Cases documented by historians reveal patterns of coercion and false accusation, where men were condemned for resisting advances or attempting to assert autonomy, and where women faced little consequence for the harm they had caused. The legal system's complicity ensured that these men remained vulnerable to both social and judicial retribution, trapped in a cycle in which compliance was mandatory and dissent could be fatal. The courts were not neutral arbiters of justice. They were active participants in maintaining the hierarchy that protected white women and punished black men. This systemic imbalance also underscores the profound intersection of race and gender in the South. The law, social perception, and domestic authority converged to create conditions in which white women could exert immense influence over black men, shaping their lives through coercion, manipulation, and the threat of legal punishment. Enslaved men navigated a precarious existence in which the line between consent and survival was continually negotiated under the shadow of laws that would favor the woman's word over their own lived experience. Every encounter, every command, and every refusal carried the weight of potential legal repercussions, reinforcing the asymmetry of power that defined daily life under slavery. By examining the way courts consistently sided with white women, we gain insight into the broader mechanisms of control that shaped the antebellum South. The law did not merely reflect social hierarchies. It reinforced them, embedding the authority of white women into the very structure of justice and ensuring that black men remained vulnerable to coercion, manipulation, and punishment. These historical realities reveal the complexity of slavery, demonstrating that oppression was enacted not only through physical labor and violence, but through the manipulation of legal, social, and domestic systems that constrained every facet of human life. Understanding this facet of history is essential for grasping the full scope of slavery's impact. The experiences of men like David and countless others illuminate the intertwined nature of law, power, and personal authority in shaping human lives, revealing how systemic favoritism could amplify vulnerability and how the law could be wielded as a tool of coercion rather than protection. These stories remind us that the legacy of slavery is not only in the chains that bound bodies but in the structures that enforced obedience, perpetuated inequality, and allowed some to wield authority over others with impunity, leaving scars that persisted long after the formal abolition of enslavement. Within the intricate web of power, control, and human vulnerability that defined the antebellum South, the relationships between white women and enslaved men often extended beyond overt coercion into the subtler, yet equally insidious, terrain of emotional manipulation, a terrain where affection itself became a weapon and love a tool of subjugation. These relationships were never equal. They were constructed within a social framework that denied black men agency and elevated white women to a position where they could shape the emotional and psychological realities of those they enslaved. Using charm, attention, and feigned intimacy to bind men to their will, one such dynamic emerges clearly in the historical records, where men living under bondage recount the constant uncertainty, the delicate negotiations of trust, and the perilous consequences of misreading the signals of their mistresses. Affection, smiles, gentle words, or fleeting gestures were not merely acts of kindness. They were instruments designed to create dependency, to mask threats, and to make compliance appear both desirable and unavoidable, while any resistance was met with punishment, removal, or public shaming. Consider the story of James, an enslaved man in Kentucky whose life became entwined with that of a white woman who managed her household with a mixture of overt authority and subtle emotional command. Their relationship, described in court records and later examined by historians, appeared superficially as a partnership, yet every layer of intimacy was mediated by the power imbalance inherent in slavery. The woman would offer moments of attention or warmth, allowing James to feel, for fleeting intervals, that he was seen and valued. Yet these moments were interspersed with stark reminders of his position, a whispered threat, the looming possibility of being sold, or the explicit knowledge that his body and labor were never fully his own. This oscillation between kindness and coercion created a psychological labyrinth in which James' choices were never entirely free. His sense of self, his perception of affection, and his understanding of loyalty were continuously manipulated to reinforce obedience. These emotionally manipulative relationships were particularly dangerous because they exploited the very human desire for connection, recognition, and care, transforming these natural impulses into mechanisms of control. Enslaved men, isolated from supportive communities and denied the ability to form autonomous bonds, were especially vulnerable to such manipulation. When a white woman expressed interest or affection, it was rarely a reflection of egalitarian care or genuine partnership, but a calculated means of ensuring compliance. Maintaining surveillance and shaping behavior, love and desire were weaponized, used to elicit cooperation, mask threats, or justify punishments when the men failed to respond according to expectations. These dynamics were not always visible to outsiders. They left no marks on the body and often remained hidden behind the polished facades of domestic life, further complicating the ability to seek justice or even to articulate the harm endured. The consequences of this manipulation extended beyond individual encounters and into the broader structure of enslaved families and communities. When affection was used to compel obedience, it disrupted the natural formation of bonds, creating confusion, mistrust, and emotional trauma that could reverberate across generations. Men like James had to navigate a constant tension between the human need for recognition and the harsh realities of enslavement, where expressions of affection were never truly reciprocal and could be withdrawn or weaponized without warning. The emotional labor imposed on these men was immense, as they were forced to decode intentions, anticipate consequences, and regulate their own responses in ways that safeguarded survival, while preserving as much dignity as possible under circumstances deliberately engineered to strip it away. Historical accounts also reveal that this manipulation was not merely personal, but often codified within household management. White women who oversaw enslaved populations could orchestrate relationships to serve economic and social objectives, encouraging or demanding emotional attachment to facilitate obedience, compliance, or reproductive aims. A gentle word could be paired with a threat of sale. A tender gesture could be intertwined with the implicit expectation of labor or sexual acquiescence. The subtle interplay of attention and power meant that men were perpetually negotiating the terms of their existence, trying to maintain a semblance of agency within a system that systematically denied it. These psychological strategies were as effective, and often as devastating, as the physical punishments more commonly documented in narratives of slavery. Furthermore, the emotional manipulation of enslaved men by white women was amplified by the surrounding social myths, which rendered these abuses invisible. The prevailing image of the innocent Southern belle obscured the reality that white women could exercise authority, enforce compliance, and exact emotional control over black men. Any recognition of these dynamics threatened entrenched beliefs about morality, gender, and racial hierarchy, so silence and denial became the default response, leaving men to endure their trauma in isolation. Oral histories collected decades later reveal the enduring impact. Men who had experienced this manipulation remembered it not only as coercion, but as a betrayal of trust, a distortion of human connection, and a violation of their autonomy that haunted their lives long after the physical bonds of slavery had been removed. Even in cases where affection appeared genuine, the power imbalance ensured that the relationship could never be fully consensual. Enslaved men could not negotiate the terms of intimacy freely. Their responses were always constrained by the threat of punishment or sale, by the ever-present reminder that their desires, bodies, and families were subordinate to the priorities of their overseers. What appeared to be love or companionship was frequently a carefully managed performance, designed to extract obedience and maintain control while preserving appearances in a society eager to believe in the inherent purity and moral superiority of white women. Understanding these relationships requires acknowledging the nuanced and often hidden forms of power that operated in the domestic sphere, where emotional manipulation was as potent a tool as physical coercion, and where the boundaries of consent were systematically erased by social, legal, and economic structures. These histories challenge simplified narratives of slavery, revealing the depth and complexity of control exercised over black men and the enduring consequences of these emotional abuses. They remind us that oppression took many forms, and that even gestures of intimacy could conceal a network of threats, manipulation, and strategic control that defined the lived experience of enslaved men, shaping their identities, relationships, and memories for generations to come. On plantations across the Antebellum South, the exploitation of enslaved men extended far beyond labor in the fields or the domestic spaces of their white overseers. It reached into the most intimate and personal aspects of their lives, where reproductive capacity became a commodity and fatherhood a duty enforced by coercion and power rather than choice or affection. Forced breeding was not a peripheral practice, but a calculated strategy designed to expand the workforce, increase wealth, and perpetuate the institution of slavery itself. And within this framework, enslaved men were systematically stripped of the most fundamental aspects of agency, autonomy, and family life. Men like Luke in Alabama, tall, strong, and valued for their physicality, were singled out not for their skills or intellect but for the capacity to produce children who would be born into bondage, inheriting the property status of their parents and ensuring the economic prosperity of the estate without further investment in the transatlantic slave trade. Every detail of reproduction, the selection of partners, the timing of unions, and the oversight of outcomes was managed by white women who wielded domestic and social authority with precision, ensuring that these men's bodies became instruments in a relentless pursuit of profit. For those subjected to forced breeding, the consequences were both immediate and long-lasting, as the act of fatherhood was divorced from love, consent, or family cohesion and transformed into an obligation imposed through threats, social pressure, and systemic enforcement. Luke did not choose who he would partner with. He did not decide which relationships would endure or which bonds he could nurture. And often he watched helplessly as the children he fathered were removed from his presence, sold to distant plantations, or assigned roles within the estate that served the strategic goals of the enslavers rather than the development of healthy family units. In the eyes of the plantation owners, these men's reproductive efforts were equivalent to a form of labor, no less valuable or more personal than tilling fields or tending animals, and they were rewarded or preserved not out of respect but to maintain peak performance and continued productivity. Even the perception of privilege, being exempt from the hardest physical labor, being well-fed or sheltered, was a veneer, a measure intended to safeguard the instrument of production rather than to grant dignity or recognition as a human being. Historical records and oral histories reveal the psychological toll of this enforced fatherhood, as men were forced into intimate relationships devoid of consent, witnessing the disintegration of familial bonds and the erosion of personal agency. Paul's account of being ordered to marry a young girl named Sally underscores the moral and emotional complexity of these arrangements. His protest, his resistance, and the knowledge that his will was subordinate to the authority of the white mistress highlight the extent to which autonomy was denied, and yet survival required compliance. When Paul refused, the mistress simply selected another man to fulfill her design, demonstrating that the men's desires were irrelevant. Their bodies were instruments, and their children were assets to be managed according to the plantation's economic imperatives. Each act of forced reproduction was layered with threats, implicit or explicit, and reinforced by the broader system of slavery, ensuring that even the slightest refusal could provoke punishment, removal, or sale, leaving men and women alike powerless to assert meaningful control over their own lives. The practice of breeding extended beyond singular acts or isolated instances. It was integrated into the daily administration of plantations, recorded meticulously in ledgers, letters, and memoirs maintained by white women overseeing the estates. Births, pairings, and even the health and physical condition of the men chosen to reproduce were tracked as part of a calculated system to ensure profitability, demonstrating the extent to which human lives were reduced to economic calculations and strategic planning. These records, when recovered by historians such as Martha Hodis and Thomas Foster, illuminate a grim reality. White women were active participants in the management, coercion, and reproduction of enslaved men, operating within a social structure that allowed them both freedom and impunity, while the men remained bound by laws, custom, and threats of violence. Every child produced under these conditions became not only property, but a reminder of the men's constrained position, the erasure of consent, and the prioritization of wealth over human dignity. The emotional ramifications were profound, as men were denied the capacity to build authentic relationships, to experience love, or to exercise choice in matters that defined their humanity. Families were broken or manipulated, affections weaponized, and the natural bonds between parent and child repeatedly disrupted to suit the economic and social imperatives of the household. The trauma of witnessing children sold or relocated, of being compelled to participate in unions orchestrated without regard for personal desire or affection, left deep psychological scars that persisted even after the formal end of slavery. Oral histories and survivor testimonies, collected decades later, speak to a legacy of silence, grief, and enforced endurance, revealing how these men carried the weight of violations that were invisible to outsiders yet devastating in their consequences. Even when enslaved men sought to resist or assert some measure of autonomy, the power imbalance made meaningful opposition nearly impossible. Threats were ever present, being sold down the river, subjected to harsher labor, or having loved ones removed as punishment. Men had to weigh the cost of disobedience against the likely outcome, understanding that any attempt to refuse reproductive coercion could trigger consequences as severe as those imposed for physical rebellion. This constant tension between survival and integrity shaped daily life, creating a landscape in which compliance was both a strategy and a compulsion, and where autonomy in intimate matters was systematically denied. The practice of forced breeding was not merely an act of control, but a deliberate and sustained component of the institution of slavery, reflecting the convergence of economic interest, social hierarchy, and gendered authority. White women exercised authority over intimate spheres with calculated intent, leveraging the social, legal, and domestic systems to ensure obedience and maximize wealth, while enslaved men were constrained by circumstances that made resistance dangerous and often deadly. This historical reality forces a reckoning with the ways in which slavery exploited every aspect of human life, from labor to family to the most personal dimensions of identity. And it compels us to recognize the depth of suffering, the pervasiveness of coercion, and the human cost embedded in the generation of wealth and maintenance of social hierarchies in the Antebellum South. Understanding the forced reproductive practices imposed upon enslaved men illuminates a critical aspect of history that has too often been overlooked, revealing the full scope of power, control, and human exploitation within slavery, and emphasizing that the legacy of these practices shaped not only the lives of those who endured them, but the social, familial, and cultural structures that persisted long after emancipation. The historical record of the Antebellum South, when carefully examined, exposes a hidden network of abuses, manipulations, and exploitations that complicates the traditional narratives of slavery, revealing the pervasive role of white women in shaping the lives and experiences of enslaved men through coercion, psychological control, and reproductive strategies. A reality preserved not only in the fragile fragments of court documents but also in oral testimonies passed down across generations, diaries tucked into attics, petitions submitted to governors, and meticulous estate records that recorded not merely transactions of property, but the management of human lives as commodities. These sources collectively paint a picture of a society in which the power dynamics within the domestic sphere were as consequential as the brutalities of the field, where the gestures of affection, the patterns of attention, and the legal authority wielded by white women converged to construct an environment in which black men navigated constant uncertainty, their actions scrutinized, their resistance constrained, and their bodies and relationships manipulated to serve objectives that were neither voluntary nor equitable. Take, for instance, the case of David in Virginia, whose life became a study in the lethal consequences of these intersecting powers. His interactions with Dolly Getz, a white woman of social standing in her community, demonstrate how abuse and manipulation could intertwine. The initial gestures of desire, the prolonged intimate involvement, and the repeated invitations to elope were couched in a veneer of affection, but carried implicit threats that could destroy a man's life. When David asserted his agency and resisted, Dolly exploited the racialized legal framework to accuse him of a crime that required neither corroboration nor evidence, a maneuver that demonstrates the extreme asymmetry of power. Even as community members petitioned to clarify the truth, the legal system upheld the broader social imperative of protecting white femininity while subordinating black male lives, highlighting a pattern repeatedly documented in other court records and memorialized in oral histories collected decades later. Similarly, James in Kentucky encountered a blend of psychological manipulation and reproductive control under the management of a white woman who supervised his domestic and emotional environment. Their relationship, ostensibly intimate and domestic, reveals how expressions of affection could be weaponized. Smiles, reassurances, and moments of seeming consideration were interwoven with coercive threats and reminders of the consequences of disobedience, including the potential for sale into harsher conditions down the river. In these accounts, historical documents such as letters, petitions, and estate records corroborate what oral histories describe with detail: the careful orchestration of relationships to extract obedience, loyalty, and labor from men who had no recourse, no legal recognition of their autonomy, and no safety in resistance. These patterns extended into reproductive exploitation, a dimension of control that transformed the most intimate aspects of life into instruments of economic and social strategy. Men like Luke in Alabama or Paul in Virginia were compelled to father children, often without choice or consent, to increase the wealth and productivity of the estate. Estate ledgers, plantation diaries, and the writings of the mistresses themselves reveal the systematic nature of this practice. Careful records of pairings, monitoring of fertility, and strategic assignments ensured that every birth served the objectives of the enslavers rather than the natural desires of the individuals involved. The children produced became property, their identities defined by inheritance of bondage, while the men were denied agency, witnessing the separation or management of their own offspring as part of the plantation's broader system of control. Oral histories recorded through projects such as the Federal Writers' Project in the 1930s capture the emotional weight of these experiences, emphasizing how men endured not only physical domination but also psychological and reproductive coercion that left scars far beyond what could be measured or documented at the time. Across these accounts, the recurring themes are unmistakable. White women exercised authority over enslaved men not only through overt commands and coercion, but also through subtler mechanisms of manipulation, control, and the shaping of emotional experience. The legal system, social norms, and domestic hierarchies reinforced these patterns, ensuring that even when abuse was evident, the men had little protection, while women could act with near impunity, alternating between gestures of care and instruments of power in ways that maintained the asymmetrical order of slavery. Diaries, estate records, and court documents reveal how these manipulations were codified, tracked, and even justified within the logic of the time, while oral testimonies provide the human dimension, recounting fear, compliance, resistance, and the long-term consequences of relationships defined by inequality and exploitation. Historians such as Martha Hodis and Thomas Foster have painstakingly pieced together these fragments, demonstrating that sexual and reproductive control was neither rare nor incidental, but an integrated aspect of the institution of slavery, particularly in households where white women wielded domestic authority in the absence or limitation of male oversight. The testimonies reveal the duality of affection as both a tool and a trap, showing how enslaved men had to constantly interpret, negotiate, and sometimes suppress their own emotions to survive, all while being compelled to participate in acts that reinforced their subjugation and the economic interests of their oppressors. The evidence further underscores the deliberate nature of these abuses, revealing that affection and intimacy were often strategically deployed to mask threats, enforce obedience, and manage reproduction, while legal and social mechanisms consistently privileged the white women who orchestrated these dynamics. Court records of accusations, petitions to governors, and the meticulous documentation of plantation life collectively attest to a society in which black men's experiences of coercion, manipulation, and reproductive exploitation were both widespread and systemically sanctioned, forming a pattern that remained largely hidden due to prevailing myths about race, gender, and morality. In synthesizing these historical sources, one begins to understand that the abuse and manipulation orchestrated by white women were multi-layered, extending across psychological, sexual, and reproductive domains, and that these patterns were reinforced by the legal and social frameworks of the time, creating an environment in which enslaved men's autonomy, dignity, and familial relationships were systematically undermined. These histories compel a deeper recognition of the complexities of slavery, the hidden forms of power wielded within domestic spaces, and the enduring legacies of trauma that shaped the lives of those who survived and the narratives that generations later would struggle to uncover, acknowledge, and preserve. In the shadowed corners of antebellum homes, behind the carefully curated facades of Southern gentility, enslaved men endured forms of abuse that, unlike the visible lash marks from overseers, left no outward scars, yet carved deep and enduring wounds into their minds and spirits, shaping every aspect of their existence with a subtlety that was as insidious as it was pervasive. And it is in these invisible injuries that the true complexity of control and coercion reveals itself. The stories preserved through oral histories, diaries, and court testimonies describe men navigating daily life under the weight of constant psychological pressure, where a glance, a whispered command, or an expression of favor could determine their fate, and the need to interpret these signals correctly became a matter of survival. Unlike the brutality of the fields, where pain could be measured, seen, and documented, the forms of manipulation that occurred within domestic and intimate spaces demanded silence and compliance, creating a psychological environment in which fear, uncertainty, and coercion intertwined to maintain dominance without the need for outward violence. Consider the account of David in Virginia, whose resistance to the advances of a white woman led to a false accusation of a crime so severe that it endangered his very life. The trauma he endured was not merely the threat of punishment, but the pervasive anxiety, shame, and tension that followed him through every interaction, as he had to carefully navigate a society structured to disregard his humanity, assume his culpability while protecting the supposed innocence of the woman who wielded authority over him. Similarly, men like James in Kentucky lived under relationships where affection itself was a weapon, a strategic tool wielded by white women to shape behavior, to enforce obedience, and to ensure compliance with reproductive and domestic expectations, transforming intimacy into a mechanism of control. The subtlety of these abuses meant that even daily interactions, being called to perform tasks, summoned for companionship, or subjected to quiet admonishments, carried layers of psychological weight, as any misstep could trigger consequences severe as being sold away from family or subjected to physical punishment, leaving men in a constant state of vigilance. Self-censorship and fear. Forced reproductive practices amplified this invisible trauma, as men were compelled to father children under conditions entirely beyond their control, with their desires, consent, and family bonds subordinated to the economic goals of the estate and the authority of white women managing these processes. Luke in Alabama, for example, fathered dozens of children, each union dictated not by choice but by the commands of those in power, and the outcomes: children sold or placed elsewhere. Bonds broken, lives disrupted left a legacy of psychological burden, grief, and helplessness that endured long after the immediate acts had passed. The absence of control, the impossibility of asserting personal agency, and the need to negotiate survival within these circumstances generated a form of trauma that was constant, internalized, and largely invisible to anyone outside the household, a trauma compounded by the social systems that refused to acknowledge the men's experiences or provide avenues for redress. Oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s illuminate how these psychological scars persisted across generations, with formerly enslaved men recalling not only specific incidents of coercion and manipulation, but also the pervasive fear, humiliation, and emotional exhaustion that defined daily life. The subtle punishments, mockery in front of peers, isolation, threats of sale, and manipulation of relationships created an environment where compliance was coerced through mental and emotional pressure as much as through physical force, and where the endurance of silent suffering became a strategy for survival. In many cases, the memory of these experiences was carried quietly, as speaking openly could invite retaliation or social ostracization, reinforcing a culture of concealment that preserved the power of the abuser while compounding the psychological impact on the victims. The trauma of these invisible abuses also extended into the realm of family and community, as men were denied the ability to protect or guide their children, forced to witness the manipulation of their partners and offspring, and burdened with the knowledge that their personal agency had been systematically stripped away. Paul's experience of being ordered into a union with a girl he did not love, and observing the rearrangement of partnerships according to the mistress's plans, underscores how the emotional consequences of forced compliance could echo through relationships, eroding trust, autonomy, and the sense of self in ways that physical punishment alone could not achieve. This manipulation, both sexual and emotional, left men negotiating a constant tension between the human need for connection and the necessity of obedience, a tension that was psychologically exhausting and morally corrosive. Historians such as Martha Hodis and Thomas Foster have highlighted how the combination of social, legal, and domestic structures facilitated these patterns of psychological abuse, demonstrating that white women in positions of domestic authority often exercised control through both overt and covert mechanisms, blending the appearance of care with threats, inducements, and strategic manipulation. The careful documentation in estate records, letters, and diaries reveals the intentionality behind these practices. Affection was calculated, surveillance was meticulous, and the emotional labor of enslaved men was extracted with precision to maintain obedience, maximize productivity, and ensure reproductive outcomes. The lasting impact of these abuses, though invisible to contemporaneous observers, manifests in the historical record through the accounts of those who survived, the oral traditions preserved by descendants, and the scholarly work that pieces together the psychological landscape of slavery. These men endured not only the labor and physical hardships imposed upon them, but also the relentless erosion of autonomy, the constant negotiation of fear and affection, and the profound moral and emotional compromises forced by their circumstances. The invisible scars, anxiety, grief, and emotional trauma were as real and enduring as any physical mark, shaping their identities, their families, and their communities long after the formal end of slavery, a testament to the pervasive, often unspoken dimensions of oppression that left deep, lasting imprints on the human psyche. For generations, the stories of abuse, manipulation, and reproductive coercion endured by enslaved black men at the hands of white women were buried beneath layers of social myth, deliberate silence, and the pervasive fear of retribution, creating a historical blind spot that has only recently begun to be illuminated by careful scholarship and oral testimony. And it is within this interwoven fabric of myth and intimidation that the realities of power, control, and psychological trauma reveal themselves in all their complexity. Southern society cultivated an image of white women as delicate, morally superior, and in need of protection, a stereotype that was repeated in literature, sermons, newspapers, and domestic instruction, portraying the innocent Southern lady as the antithesis of aggression, coercion, or participation in the machinery of slavery, while simultaneously constructing black men as dangerous, hypersexualized, and inherently criminal, a dual narrative that justified both the subjugation of one group and the presumed virtue of the other. These social constructs were reinforced in every sphere, from the courtrooms where testimony from black men was dismissed or discredited to the domestic spaces where white women exercised authority over labor, emotion, and reproduction, allowing actions that might otherwise have been condemned to occur with impunity and leaving no recourse for those most affected. The fear of punishment and social ostracism further silenced the men who experienced these abuses. A glance, a rumor, or a suggestion that a white woman had overstepped boundaries could trigger consequences as severe as death, sale, or public humiliation, ensuring that generations of black men carried the burden of their trauma in silence, concealing the depth of their suffering even from those closest to them. Oral histories collected during the Federal Writers' Project in the 1930s reveal men recounting episodes of coercion, manipulation, and forced reproduction with measured caution, often framing their experiences obliquely or using euphemisms to avoid endangering themselves or their families. And yet even in these careful retellings, the psychological weight and moral complexities of these relationships emerge with striking clarity, revealing the persistent intersections of race, gender, and power that structured everyday life under slavery. Consider the case of David in Virginia. The broader myth of white female innocence shielded Dolly Getz from the full consequences of her actions, even as she coerced, manipulated, and ultimately endangered his life. When he resisted her advances, the legal system immediately favored her narrative, enforcing a racialized and gendered hierarchy that protected her reputation, while placing his very existence at risk. Similar patterns are evident in Kentucky with James, in Alabama with Luke, and in countless other lives partially preserved in estate records, court petitions, diaries, and letters. In each instance, the veneer of gentility, morality, and delicacy provided a social shield behind which abuses could be orchestrated, while the constant threat of punishment for speaking out ensured that these patterns remained hidden, creating a collective silence that endured across generations and geographical boundaries. The myth of the Southern lady was more than a mere stereotype. It was a tool of social control, shaping perceptions of acceptable behavior and limiting the credibility of those who might expose inconvenient truths. Any challenge to this narrative, whether through testimony, written complaint, or rumor, was likely to be met with disbelief, hostility, or violence, reinforcing the structural inequalities that permitted such abuses to continue. Enslaved men, aware that speaking the truth could result in immediate harm, often chose silence over self-preservation, encoding their experiences in stories passed quietly within families, in gestures, or in oblique references that would only be fully understood by later generations committed to uncovering the hidden layers of history. This intergenerational silence preserved the status quo, allowing myths of innocence and virtue to flourish even as the everyday realities of coercion, manipulation, and reproductive control went unacknowledged in the public record. The social mythology also functioned to obscure the deliberate and strategic exercise of power by white women over enslaved men. By promoting an image of passivity, delicacy, and moral purity, these women were able to manipulate domestic and reproductive hierarchies while maintaining a public persona that conformed to societal expectations. Court documents, petitions, and diaries reveal that white women frequently leveraged these social perceptions to shield themselves from accountability, to coerce obedience, and to exploit both labor and reproductive potential without fear of reprisal, demonstrating that the myths of innocence were not merely coincidental but actively cultivated to facilitate control. Even in cases where legal testimony or community petitions surfaced, the prevailing narratives of morality and virtue often diminished the perceived severity of the women's actions, while magnifying the culpability of black men, reinforcing the structural inequities that allowed these dynamics to persist. Oral testimonies recorded decades later highlight the enduring psychological and social impact of this systemic silencing. Men spoke of the constant uncertainty, the careful calculation required to navigate daily life, and the emotional weight of being subjected to abuse that could not be acknowledged without endangering oneself. These accounts reveal how myths and fear worked hand in hand to enforce obedience, mask exploitation, and maintain hierarchies of power that extended beyond individual households to shape community norms and legal outcomes. The combination of societal disbelief, gendered protectionism, and the threat of violent retribution ensured that these stories remained marginalized, preserved largely through whispers, carefully coded narratives, and fragmentary documentation, and they were only fully reconstructed through the dedicated work of historians revisiting court records, letters, diaries, and oral histories. The result is a complex picture of slavery in which social myths, legal frameworks, and domestic authority intersected to obscure profound abuses while shaping the psychological, emotional, and reproductive experiences of enslaved men. The enduring silence of these stories reflects the power of cultural narratives to suppress inconvenient truths and highlights the courage required by both the men who endured these abuses and the scholars who later sought to recover their voices. By understanding how the myth of the innocent Southern lady functioned in tandem with the threat of punishment to suppress testimony, we gain insight not only into the specific abuses suffered by enslaved men but also into the broader mechanisms of social control, gendered power, and racialized oppression that structured life in the antebellum South, reminding us that the stories we inherit are often incomplete, and that uncovering hidden histories requires careful attention to both documented evidence and the subtle traces left in memory, oral tradition, and cultural record. As we reach the close of this chapter, it is essential to reflect on how modern scholarship has begun to illuminate the stories that were long buried beneath the weight of silence. Social myth and fear. Researchers like Martha Hodes and Thomas A. Foster have painstakingly combed through court records, diaries, letters, estate inventories, and oral histories to piece together a fuller, more nuanced understanding of the lives of enslaved black men and the complex dynamics of power that shaped their experiences. Through their work, the voices of those who were denied agency, whose lives were subjected to manipulation, coercion, and reproductive exploitation, have finally begun to emerge from the shadows, allowing us to confront the realities that had been erased from public memory for centuries. These scholars have only recovered individual stories, but also contextualized them within the broader structures of slavery, demonstrating that the abuses orchestrated by white women, whether through emotional manipulation, sexual coercion, or forced reproduction, were part of systemic patterns of control that extended across households, plantations, and entire regions of the antebellum South. By uncovering these hidden histories, contemporary historians challenge us to reevaluate long-held assumptions about power, innocence, and victimhood. The myth of the delicate Southern lady, once used to justify and obscure abuse, is now understood as a constructed narrative that concealed harsh realities and protected those who wielded authority from scrutiny. Likewise, the idea that enslaved men were passive participants in these dynamics is dismantled by the careful testimony of those who survived, revealing the complex strategies, acts of resistance, and moral negotiations that defined their daily lives. These recovered stories remind us that the human capacity for resilience endures even under the most oppressive conditions, and that documenting these experiences is an act of justice that restores dignity to those whose lives were once treated as property rather than as fully human. Importantly, these historical revelations also compel us to confront the lasting psychological and social impacts of such abuses. The trauma endured by enslaved men, emotional manipulation, loss of autonomy, coerced reproductive labor, and the constant threat of punitive measures echoed through generations, shaping family structures, personal identities, and community memories long after emancipation. The work of Hodes, Foster, and other scholars provides a framework to understand not only the mechanics of power and exploitation, but also the enduring consequences of systemic injustice. By studying these stories, we recognize the layers of resilience, sorrow, and resistance embedded within the lived experiences of enslaved individuals, and we gain insight into the ways historical injustices reverberate through time. For viewers of this series, it is worth pausing to acknowledge the courage it takes to bring these narratives to light. Sharing these histories, no matter how difficult, ensures that the truth of human experience under slavery is not sanitized or forgotten. By confronting the uncomfortable realities of power, coercion, and systemic oppression, we honor the memory of those whose lives were constrained and shaped by forces beyond their control. This act of remembrance is more than an academic exercise. It is a moral imperative that asserts the value of every human story, especially those that were intentionally obscured. In recognizing the voices of men like David, James, Luke, and countless others whose names may never be fully recorded, we are reminded of the importance of vigilance in preserving historical truth and of our responsibility to challenge narratives that seek to minimize suffering or erase agency. If you have followed this series and learned from these stories, I encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who value understanding history in its full complexity. By doing, you help ensure that these stories continue to reach wider audiences. Fostering awareness, empathy, and a deeper appreciation for the intricacies of human history that have too often been hidden or distorted. Each view, like, and subscription supports the work of bringing underrepresented histories to light, amplifying the voices of those who endured the unimaginable and reminding us of the resilience of the human spirit. As we conclude, remember that the histories we have explored are not simply tales of suffering, they are narratives of survival, courage, and the persistent pursuit of dignity in the face of systemic oppression. The revelations of modern scholarship give us the tools to confront uncomfortable truths, to question inherited assumptions, and to honor those whose lives were shaped by the harshest of circumstances. Let these stories serve as a reminder of the importance of truth, the power of documentation, and the enduring impact of remembering. Thank you for watching, for engaging with these histories, and for joining us in this journey of discovery. Your attention and curiosity matter, and by valuing these narratives, you contribute to a world that seeks to understand, acknowledge, and honor the full spectrum of human experience. Good night, and may your reflections on these stories inspire both compassion and a commitment to uncovering truth in all its dimensions.